The UN has imposed another round of sanctions against North Korea. Pyongyang conducted its largest nuclear test earlier this month. But do sanctions like these work in North Korea or elsewhere in the world? And is it the people who suffer the most? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. It's a cycle of provocation, condemnation, followed by sanctions, repeated time and time again. North Korea has been under some form of UN or US sanction for the better part of the past 25 years. Now the Security Council has imposed more sanctions targeting Pyongyang's oil imports and textile exports, two industries it relies on heavily. The sanctions are a response to North Korea's sixth and largest nuclear test earlier this month. But existing sanctions don't seem to have much sway in preventing the government from developing its nuclear and missile program. So how will these new sanctions be any different? Let's bring in our panel. In London, we have Emil Dall, a research fellow specialising in nuclear proliferation and sanctions policy at the Royal United Services Institute in Berlin. Sarah Brockmeier, a project manager at the Global Public Policy Institute specialising in mass atrocity prevention. And joining us on Skype from Cape Town, Richard Poplak, who is a senior contributor to the Daily Maverick. A very warm welcome to all of you. Emil Dall, do you think this latest round of sanctions will finally work? Will it do what these sanctions have been trying to do? Will it bring this regime to heel?
No, I don't. I don't think this round of sanctions will make a significant difference in North Korea scaling back its nuclear and missile program. We are now too late in the game for denuclearization to still be on the agenda for the North Koreans. But sanctions are still incredibly useful in sending a clear message to North Korea that its provocative actions will not go unresponded. And it also sends another signal to would-be violators, other countries who see North Korea getting off with provocative behavior. It sends a very clear message to them that the international community will bring penalty against you if you violate international law.
Sarah Brockmeier, do you think that these sanctions have any chance of succeeding where other sanctions have so far failed?
Whether sanctions will work in North Korea will very much depend whether they are embedded, and this is always the case with sanctions, in a larger political strategy. So I'm not hopeful that this is going to be the case in this case, because essentially what would be needed is a political strategy that has everybody on board, including the United States and North Korea, obviously, but also China and Russia. And even just in the United States, if you look at the State Department that has been severely understaffed so far, it is very unlikely that we'll have any kind of political strategy, any chance of essentially rallying people and countries around a common goal on this North Korea issue. So I do not believe that this is going to be very successful. What
about you, Richard Poplak? I mean, those sanctions really are stacking up, aren't they? I mean, is this tightening of the noose helping in any way?
Well, I hate to be the voice of sort of closed consensus here, but having lived through sanctions as a boy here in South Africa, there's a very curious aspect to sanctions when you're sort of in the middle of the hurricane, as it were, and that is that some people get very, very rich very quickly. Others get very, very poor very quickly. And it's certainly with the apartheid regime, it was very unclear whether sanctions actually felled the regime itself. I would argue that sanctions, which kicked off in 1986 and ended in 1991, and the end of apartheid at the end of 1989, the beginning of 1990, were coincidental. I don't think sanctions had as much impact on the South African economy as many academics believe that it did. And I think that narrative as well has been turned around a lot since recent data has come to light.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay, so Sarah, sorry, Richard, you raised some important points there. I mean, you reckon that there needs to be the political will, the political framework, but also how do you prevent people from circumnavigating these sanctions? There are many ways, aren't there?
I mean, essentially, in UN sanctions, theoretically, everyone is legally obliged to implement them. And in essence, sanctions are effective if they target those that have political power, those that actually have the power to change something. And yes, there is no legal huge recourse, essentially, if countries are circumventing sanctions. This would simply be then the responsibility of national legal systems to pursue.
All right, let's take a look now at some of the most prominent sanctions of the past century. The US has maintained an embargo on Cuba for more than 50 years. The goal was to end the Castro government, but it's still in power. South Africa, on the other hand, is often seen as an example of a successful sanctions campaign. Though Richard had some comments to make about that. Some say an economic blockade imposed in 1985 forced the minority white government to step down. And in the 1990s, the UN blocked food and medicine imports to Iraq to pressure Saddam Hussein to give up his suspected stockpile of chemical weapons, which didn't work. And the blockade may have led to the deaths of thousands of children. Heavy sanctions on Iran arguably pushed Tehran to the negotiating table in 2015, which were lifted after the nuclear deal went into effect. But President Donald Trump has imposed new sanctions. Trump also levied new restrictions on Russia on the same day. That's in response to its suspected interference in last year's US election and its aggression in eastern Ukraine. If you look at all of those together, Emil, you've got to ask the question, do sanctions in general really work?
Well, I think the cases you've referred to just now are really quite different, and they warrant different examinations. The Iraq case, as you point out, was a comprehensive embargo on the country, which ended up causing massive humanitarian consequences. With Iran, the sanctions that were constructed were much more sectoral, targeting Iran's vital exports in terms of oil, targeting the Iranian financial industry's access to the global financial system, and basically isolating the regime. But what was really vital with the Iran case is the combination of negotiations. So as sanctions were hardened against Iran, you also see an uptick in negotiations. You saw an uptick in the willingness by the European Union and the United States to engage in a structured and clear negotiation on the sidelines of those sanctions. I do think we've learned a lot from sanctions over the years, and the mistakes that we made in the Iraq case in the 1990s, those are mistakes that we've learned from and won't be repeated again. So I think Iran is a really good example of where sanctions are today, how we can use sanctions effectively, but they only work when we guide them and pair them up with some other form of diplomatic tool, in this case negotiations.
And in South Africa, Richard, what do you think the combination was that worked alongside sanctions? I mean, the National Party was pretty much bankrupt towards the end. Was it the fall of the Iron Curtain? Was it the anti-apartheid movement? What was it?
Well, you're exactly right. There were all these other factors that were there in play. If you look at the massive sort of moments of capital outflow in South Africa, they came after huge uprisings. Sharpeville, then the Soweto uprisings, and then, of course, all of the unrest in the 1980s. So that had something to do with it as well. To put the end of apartheid entirely at sanctions' feet would be a mistake, and would be to undersell the uprising of black South Africans at the time. That had a lot to do with it. Mismanagement, financial, governmental mismanagement also had a lot to do with it. There seems to be a misconception that the apartheid regime was a well-run regime. It was not. There was a lot of fiscal mismanagement, so that had a lot to do with it as well. All of these factors came into play. You know, there has been this sort of revisionist movement here in South Africa looking at how effective sanctions actually were.
What about capital flight, Sarah? I mean, how does that work when sanctions have been imposed on a country and that money is taken out of the country? Effectively, the people, the common man, woman, will they not then bear the brunt of the sanctions? Because the money that should be going to them towards their education possibly is going into the regime, the government's hands instead.
Yes, I think you mentioned a very important aspect of the sanctions debate that's been going on for decades, actually, at this point. And Iraq, as you mentioned and Emil mentioned, was one example of pretty much disastrous effects of larger economic sanctions. There were thousands of children and people killed. But it's also important to say that the international community did, in fact, I think, learn from these failures as well. And you've seen much more of a shift in the last 2 decades, in particular, from these larger economic sanctions that are affecting, essentially, can affect everybody and most of the time even affect normal people more than political leaders in power. We've seen a shift from that to more targeted so-called smart sanctions that are actually supposed to affect individuals. So this is a lot of times targeting individual political leaders' financial assets, if they have any financial assets abroad, or this is targeting their, essentially imposing travel bans on them. So it's always important to keep in mind these individual targeted sanctions, because that's a big part of the sanctions regimes that have now at this point been passed by the United Nations. There are at this point 13 sanctions regimes passed by the UN Security Council, and more than 600 individuals are on that list.
Emil, talking about Russia and the impact of sanctions there and targeted strikes, and I mean, there's some estimates of hundreds of thousands of children died because of that. What should happen then to those behind those sanctions, behind that action? Surely they can't get away with it. I mean, what makes them any better?
I mean, so looking at the North Korean case right now, the effect of sanctions on the North Korean regime is very difficult to measure, because the North Korean regime has become very capable of operating abroad and evading sanctions. They set up huge corporate networks operating in China, but also in other countries, that allows them to actually navigate through a very complex sanctions framework. So to start with, it's very difficult to completely isolate a country. But you also have to think about, well, what does complete isolation mean? Will complete isolation necessarily result in the outcome that we wish to achieve? And there it's really important, as I said before, to think of what other things can we make sanctions a pair with. Sanctions can't just be a default choice.
I mean, you would think, excuse me, that isolation would have quite a strong psychological effect on leadership and the nation itself, but not in North Korea, it seems.
Well, North Korea is a completely different country. We don't know very much about the internal workings of North Korea. So the sanctions theory usually says we bring economic pressure on a regime, domestic opposition grows within the country in response to that economic pressure and forces the leadership into changing behavior that is not in compliance with international law. With North Korea, it's not clear that the calculation works exactly that way.
All right, Sarah, China is supposed to abide by these sanctions. We know that it's not very successful at imposing them strictly. What should happen to countries like China in this case? Do you favor what Trump says, that these countries should be penalized, punished, that trade should be stopped? Because it certainly works in other countries, doesn't it?
You'll have to find measures of punishment that work. I don't think that it would be a very smart strategy for the US to stop all trade with China. The smarter strategy would be to find a common solution, to negotiate with China, to find some common ground that they would actually, this is what I think the State Department and the Trump administration should pursue. If I can just say one more thing on the kind of the individuals sanctioned and on the context. Essentially, it's anytime, no matter if it's economic or targeted sanctions, it's extremely important to know who is it that you are trying to target and what is the political context. Just to give you an example of what doesn't work, in South Sudan, we've had UN sanctions imposed, and the US has long-term sanctions imposed on South Sudanese warlords, essentially, that are fighting amongst each other. And there, sanctions have no effect, essentially, because most of them don't actually even have assets outside of the country. And essentially, sanctions are almost a badge of honor. If you are on the US sanctions list, you have really made it. So in that case, it has even the adverse effect. So this is just to illustrate, you always have to really well analyze the political context that you are moving in and that you want to employ these sanctions in.
Yeah, Richard, that's a good point, isn't it? I mean, you've got to know what the case for the sanctions is, who you're trying to target. Is it the leadership, the people? And in many cases, I mean, what happens if Kim Jong-un is forced to leave? Look what happened to Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe.
Well, exactly. And I think these new sort of more targeted, fancier, shinier sanctions do make a little more sense. But again, in Zimbabwe, it just simply hasn't worked. Although the ZANU-PF leadership has been targeted, and although there's been blanket sort of shutdowns of entire sectors of the economy there, basically the leadership manages to smuggle wealth out of the country through the diamond industry, for instance, out of the Morange diamond fields, and that is sort of birthing its own humanitarian crisis. So Zimbabwe is another case of a place where sanctions, however well-meaning, and however certainly in the sort of sanctions 2.0 version, are certainly not working.
Richard, let's talk a little bit more about the sanctions busters, whether it be the leaders, those imposing the sanctions, the black market traders. I mean, how does it all work under a sanctions mantle?
There's a series of articles that have run in the Daily Maverick that sort of look back at the apartheid regime and how sort of other countries in Europe managed to circumvent the whole sanctions sanctions regime. The perfect example appeared in the Daily Maverick today, and it pertains to France, where the French systematically went about getting around the embargo, especially the arms embargo, in order to prop up French arms sales from the French, what is now the French arms company Thale. These were horrific sort of sanctions busting moves that were that they came rubber stamped right at the very top. That was a complete a completely French program almost.
And Sarah, it's still happening today. If you look at Yemen, the British government is involved in arming the Saudi-led offensive there. We know that the US is also sending weapons, yet they are also signatories, yet they also sit on the UN Security Council. I mean, how do you get that sort of balance right when you're preaching one thing in one country and then behaving in a different manner?
Well, hypocrisy, unfortunately, is a big part of all of international relations. I mean, just to make this point again, if there is a UN Security Council resolution, if there is a UN sanctions regime, that has to be translated into law. For example, within the European Union, they implement EU sanctions, and then every country and every company will have to comply with these sanctions. And if they don't, they actually should be liable in EU and national law. So in that sense, there is a legal recourse as well.
Emil, I'm just wondering, and this does go back to South Africa, but I'm just wondering how it applies generally. This is from F.W. de Klerk, the former president. He wrote that he believed that sanctions actually delayed change, that isolation nipped change in the bud, and I'm praising this. He said South Africa should have been allowed to grow economically and change would have come sooner. Do you think that could benefit countries like Iran, for example, or do countries, because of sanctions, become more self-sustainable?
Well, I think it works in both ways, because when you have sanctions installed, sanctions are most effective when they're lifted again. So countries that are feeling under sanctions also know that if they change behavior according to what the UN Security Council says, that behavior change can lead to a lifting of sanctions. So I think it works both ways. I just wanted to pick up on a point that was made a bit earlier, and it's worth remembering that many sanctions regimes today are actually pursued unilaterally. So the sanctions regimes against Iran hit very hardest when it was just the US and European unilateral sanctions that were brought against Iran. The European Union has had a weird relationship with sanctions for many years. They've been opposed to US sanctions, especially when they were impacting on European business interests, and have had things like blocking statutes in place, which have forbidden German companies, for example, from complying with US sanctions that said don't do business with Cuba. The European Union has changed that a little bit, and they're now more on board with what we call secondary sanctions in the US terminology. But what's really powerful about sanctions is the fact that you can lift them again, and a behavior change can lead to that lifting.
And Sarah, the love of sanctions, if I can put it that way, it's sanctions, or what's the alternative? Is it a military option? Is it the last line of defense, attack?
Well, in all kind of conflict prevention, conflict mitigation efforts that we have, sanctions is just simply one tool of many that we have next to diplomatic measures. We have changes to development aid. We have all kinds of pressures. And yes, we also have a range of military tools obviously available. And for all of these measures, again, you always have this rule, essentially. They have to be employed in the context of a political strategy. You have to have some kind of political goal, and you have to pursue that goal within basically all these tools that you have. Where you don't have that, you will not have any success.
Richard, when do you think sanctions as a foreign policy tool become futile?
You know, futile is a big word. Look, I think, again, context is so critical. The targeting of sanctions, the designing of sanctions is so critical. If there are holes in, let's call it the sanction wall, as there were with South Africa, for instance, Switzerland didn't join the European community embargo at all. So that was enough of a gap for the apartheid regime to move money through Swiss bank accounts. So without there being a sort of concerted, one could almost think of it as sort of like a entirely global effort when it comes to sanctions, those holes in the wall often make these things futile.
Okay, Emil, if sanctions are not working, we're not seeing it work in North Korea at the moment, is it time now for a rethink of sanctions? Can those 15 members on the council get together and come up with something a lot more effective that doesn't involve a military option?
I'm not sure, but you also have to remember that sanctions serve a multitude of uses in the North Korean case. Sanctions, if implemented correctly by all countries, can constrain the regime's activities abroad, can disrupt their illicit networks, trading networks that operate in Southeast Asia, in China, in Africa, even in Europe. But sanctions so far have been linked to denuclearization. They've been linked to the objective that if we bring sanctions against North Korea will turn back from the nuclear brink. I don't think we're at that stage anymore. We cannot keep bringing more and more sanctions against North Korea without actually stepping back and thinking, what is our objective with doing this? How do sanctions fit into a wider strategy? And how can we make sanctions a tool of that wider strategy rather than an end in themselves? Otherwise, we risk sanctions becoming a default option and the North Korean regime knowing that. Of course, that doesn't mean that, that sanctions are not hitting the North Korean regime hard. They are absolutely feeling some impact of these sanctions, and everything we bring against them makes it more and more difficult for the North Korean regime to operate.
Sarah, do you think it's time to finesse sanctions as a foreign policy tool, or just come up with something far smarter?
I think essentially with any foreign policy instrument that you have, we don't have that many options. So essentially the fact that sanctions can be ineffective and often are ineffective when they are badly implemented doesn't mean that we should just throw this tool that we have out of the window and start with others. Essentially, it means we have to invest more in getting smarter at them and employing them in the correct way, and in essentially developing more sophisticated, smarter, more developed tools.
Well, thank you, all three of you, for talking us through sanctions, what they mean, the impact that they've had or not. Emil Dall, Sarah Brockmeier, and Richard Poplak. And thank you as always for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. Mine is @Jane Dutton. Goodbye from me and the rest of the team.